Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast.
Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast. I'm Professor Christopher Jain Miller, and I'm joined today by my colleague Anna Halafoff, who is an associate professor in Sociology of Religion and Religious Studies at Deakin University in Australia. Welcome to the podcast, Anna. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself for the audience so they can get to know you?
Thank you, Chris. It's a great pleasure to be here. Yeah, sure. So I'm a sociologist of religion, and I research spirituality and Buddhism, both very much in the Australian context. I've also been studying and practicing yoga and Buddhism for over 35 years now, a bit hard to believe, mainly in Tibetan Buddhist traditions. And in terms of my positionality, so I was born in Australia into a family of Russian and Georgian heritage. So my family fled communism, but retained their Russian culture in exile. And my grandmother was a huge influence on my life and was a very spiritual person. And her aunt was in the Theosophical Society. So she used to actually joke with me when I got into Buddhism that I was possibly her Aunt Nina's reincarnation. So my dad was really into judo and also some Zen Buddhist philosophy, art, and architecture. He'd lived in Japan in the 60s. And so I grew up very much with these so-called Eastern European, but also Eastern spiritual traditions within my life, and also in the kind of aesthetics of our home and our garden, and very much a strong influence of Zen Buddhism there as well.
Well, it's wonderful to have you on the podcast. I think we share a lot of things in common. We've worked on initiatives together outside of the Engaged Jain Studies podcast and continue to do so. And one of the things that you're doing right now is teaching a course, Buddhism, Non-Action, and Compassionate Responsibility for us. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this course. And what I really appreciate about your work is you are in the tension, like I am and many of our colleagues, of balancing what it means to be a scholar and a practitioner, and kind of navigating those tensions and opportunities and what that means from the identity perspective, our professional perspective, and all these things. So I'm looking forward to hearing your perspectives on that as we go through and talk about this course and just your experience in Buddhism and as well in yoga. So before we talk about Buddhism and compassion in Buddhism as part of the Compassion Studies Initiative here, I would like to ask you personally, what does compassion mean to you?
Well, I must say that my view of compassion is very Buddhist. It's very framed by the studies that I have been doing in Buddhism, as I mentioned, for quite a long period of time. And that understanding of compassion, I think, also has really deepened through both the intellectual inquiry, but also my own practice of Buddhism. And particularly in more recent years, some really long retreats I've been fortunate enough to do in the Dzogchen Buddhist tradition, and also texts that I've been reading in that tradition by Longchen Rabjam. So what is compassion? In Buddhism, we typically think of compassion as the wish for others to be free of suffering. So in order to understand compassion in Buddhism, you also kind of have to understand suffering and the cessation of suffering, which, is the basis of the Four Noble Truths and also the Bodhisattva's way of life. So to unpack that, I think that there is a sense that there is suffering that's kind of just part of the human condition, kind of ordinary suffering of old age, sickness, and death. But then there's other layers of suffering around clinging to a sense of a fixed self, and a sense that we're somehow like a separate self. And then all the kind of desire and the grasping and the fear and things that can come from that. Like if you think of yourself as a very isolated and impermanent being in that way. And I think what Buddhism really helps you to understand, or certainly has helped me to understand, is a little bit more about who I really am and what the nature of reality really is. So, and this is, I guess, where the Dzogchen view of compassion comes in for me too, is that in Dzogchen, there's a sense that there's a underlying natural state. And some people in other Buddhist traditions will call this Buddha nature. In Dzogchen, we just call it like natural state. And this natural state has qualities. And some of these qualities, and one of the most important qualities, is compassion. So love, compassion, bliss, wisdom, awareness. So these kind of qualities are there in the Dzogchen view as the underlying nature of reality, what is known as the all good. And they're also there in us. So there's a kind of sense that compassion, that the state of the universe is naturally compassionate. It is loving, it is kind, and it can kind of hold us. And that also we as beings are naturally compassionate. And the more we can connect with, remember, and in Dzogchen language, kind of just be in that, rest in that natural state, the more it's said that compassion as a natural quality within us and of the universe will arise. It will arise naturally in us. So we'll learn to kind of be less fearful and grasping, and more open and more spacious, more aware of our interconnectedness with others. And also in that awareness of interconnectedness with others, naturally kind of not want to harm anyone else, naturally want to be compassionate towards others. So that's why in the course we have this emphasis also on this compassionate responsibility that is a kind of natural quality of the universe, but also of our deeper selves.
Yeah, I really appreciate that it's described as a natural quality of the universe, a natural quality that is kind of at the core of who we are from a Buddhist perspective. And I think that some of the other traditions that have been taught on our platform would share some sense of that as well, right? And we have a lot of courses in the Compassion Studies Initiative about Jain approaches to compassion. And what I really appreciate about yours, and I think what students will realize, is that in Buddhism, there are a lot of overlapping practices that might not be taught exactly the same, but there are some core features such as compassion and compassionate responsibility, as you're going to teach it, that also connect these traditions together in various ways. And so I really see that coming out in your course. And I'm thinking that students will appreciate the comparative approach as well for themselves, who are used to probably studying more Jain-focused things. We'll also have other Hindu approaches as well to compassion, and this kind of links them all together. So we're thrilled to have you on the platform, on the podcast, and to have this course on Buddhism, non-action, and compassionate responsibility. And I'm wondering if you might tell us a little bit, just like an overview of what this course is that you're developing, what it looks like from a kind of highest level view, how you're going to approach this course.
So the course covers understandings of compassion, as I mentioned, and understandings of suffering, but also has this emphasis on action and non-action because we are talking about contemplative practices as well. So the course develops from, first of all, like really looking at these terms, compassion, karuna, and also loving kindness, and understanding Buddha's teachings. And of course, there's a wide diversity of Buddhisms. So we're going to look at some underlying kind of concepts that are across them, but then also go into some more specific differences between the different schools, Theravadan and Mahayana and Vajrayana and Dzogchen Buddhist understandings of these teachings. The course also has a real emphasis on practice. So we're going to practice together some forms of meditation, loving kindness meditation, Tonglen meditation, and Trekso meditation, which is a Dzogchen resting in natural states meditation. And then we're going to look at how we can take this practice also kind of off the cushion out into the world, and how we as Buddhists, if this compassionate responsibility naturally arises that we've just discussed, what that looks like in real life. So we're going to look at some contemporary Buddhist teachings around social justice and injustice as a form of suffering, and ways that Buddhist teachers and scholars are engaging with what is commonly called socially engaged Buddhism, but again, in ways that can involve action and activism, and other ways that are more still and involve what on the surface at least will appear like non-action, but actually there can be quite a lot still going on there in terms of the cultivation of compassion within oneself and also for all beings.
Yeah, you're really, in this course, I can see, and having, of course, gone through the syllabus already, I can see that you're playing with that tension between action and non-action, activism, non-activism. And I know that this is a debate even within, for example, the field of engaged Buddhism, when we talk about what does it mean to be an engaged Buddhist? Does it mean we are socially engaged? Does it mean that we only focus on ourselves? And your course really seems to try to thread a needle here with bringing these two conversations together in a very kind of sensitive way to address this question, particularly probably mostly from the tradition that you're trained in, but also from a Buddhist perspective, more broadly grounded in compassion. And so I really appreciate that because I think it will add some new ideas about what it means to be an engaged Buddhist, and also covers topics such as self-care versus care for the world, and those kinds of tensions between those things, which we grapple with frequently, of course. And so I'll go through right now, there's 4 parts of this course. I'll go through them with you and ask you to say a little bit more about what students can expect to encounter as they navigate these tensions that we have described, that you have described here. And so the first part is compassion in Buddhism. And I notice here in the course that you describe Buddhism as Buddhisms with an S, plural, because I think you're trying to focus on the fact that there isn't just one Buddhism, although compassion may be a thread that ties a lot of Buddhist traditions together. You're teaching what compassion and loving kindness, for example, mean in Buddhism. But do you want to say a little bit more about the diversity of these traditions and how they may or may not be tied together through these very basic practices of compassion and loving kindness?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah. So in that first class, we're going to focus very much on getting this kind of deeper understanding of what is metta, loving kindness, and what is compassion, karuna. But as you've mentioned, there are different approaches to this, to understanding this across the diverse traditions. So I've set a couple of readings here. So one is by psychologist John McCransky, and this reading really goes into some of the differences between Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana Buddhism. And he doesn't really name Dzogchen so much at the end, but his approach in Vajrayana is actually quite similar to a Dzogchen view. So I think it's very interesting to look at these different types of Buddhisms, similarities between them, and then also differences. And then we've also got readings by the very well-known Buddhist teacher Sharon Salzberg, and also a great reading by Damien Keon on Buddhism and elephants, which actually is maybe less focused explicitly on compassion, but for people who are engaging in the course, it gives some good background to, and really stresses the diversity of Buddhisms. So yeah, that first week is kind of like an introduction to Buddhism, an introduction into these concepts. And then there's also some opportunity to listen through videos and recordings of some very well-known teachers, Khandro Rinpoche, Yonggi Mingyu Rinpoche, and also the Dalai Lama on compassion.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm looking at these readings as you're saying it here and realizing how rich the syllabus and the bibliography are for students and accessible as well. And so with that being said, and as you go into the second part of the class, Buddhist practices of compassion, I suspect that this might be part of the way that you will introduce students to actual practices of loving kindness and compassion as you've listed them here. And also, you've noted that this can be done in a Buddhist or a secular way. And I think one of the things that attracts people to Buddhism is the fact that in some ways, even if you're not a committed Buddhist, there are practices within the tradition that could be practiced in, as you say, a secular way, or by people who consider themselves to live without a commitment to a religious tradition. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about those kind of questions and some of the practices that might be encountered.
Sure. So in the second class, it is very much focused on practice, and particularly a very kind of well-known practice called Tonglen, which is a practice that's known as kind of exchanging self for others, but also is one that's very compassion-centered. It also uses the breath, and it's very much focused on meditating on, usually it's taught on someone else's suffering, and then being given techniques to help release that suffering. I'm really inspired here by Pema Chodron. Her book, Start Where You Are, was such a profound text for me in my own journey. I spent about a year just working with this text. And in Start Where You Are, Chodron really focuses on that you can do Tonglen for yourself as well. You can do Tonglen to really help release some of the pain and the suffering and the brokenheartedness that we all carry around within us. So in a secular sense, in this lifetime, in a Buddhist sense, from numerous lifetimes, right? Given that Buddhists often believe in reincarnation. So we're going to look at these practices, but also inspired by Tara Brach's meditations and also Mingyu Rinpoche's instructions, and explore Tonglen in this it's quite approachable, as in the way that I'll be teaching Tonglen, but also the way that these teachers teach Tonglen. It doesn't really need to involve anything particularly Buddhist, as in no particular kind of veneration of any particular Buddhist deity, or involve any prayers or anything like that. So for people who are more actually Buddhist, we'll have options at the beginning of these practices to say dedications or to connect with Buddhist deities. So that really does appeal to a lot of people who are Buddhist. But we can also do this in completely non-Buddhist ways through connecting with these qualities of loving kindness and compassion through memories, through reflections, through connecting with nature, or a very sort of traditional Buddhist approach, but doesn't really have to have any Buddhist imagery in it, connecting to loving kindness that you might have received from your mother or from another carer or another being. In my case, certainly, it's my grandmother that I think of when I do those meditations. So yeah, there's some examples of what we'll do to help. And the practices are really powerful. They're powerful for cultivating compassion, but they're also really powerful healing practices to help with our own suffering, or if, for those who we know and love, and also for places in the world at the moment that are experiencing, intense pain and conflict in Gaza, in Ukraine, in other parts of the world. So these practices can also be done in that way for bigger communities and groups of people, and for the whole world even. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, one of the things that I pick up on here as you're going through this is that self-compassion is an important component of this. Self-healing is an important component of this. And can you say a little bit more about how in Buddhism and or from a secular perspective, why self-compassion is so important as part of this process of cultivating compassion for others.
Yeah, the Dalai Lama, I once heard him say in a public talk that I went to, but I mean, I think this has been well said and written in other places as well, that in so-called Western society, he was surprised when he first started coming to the West, what a kind of sort of negative sense of self a lot of people have. And in some of the readings that we've set in this unit, in the previous week and then this week, there's a lot there too about how there are obviously parts of life that we all have to go through that are very difficult, suffering, but also grief and some of these more difficult emotions of anger and of self, not having a lot of self-love actually. And so in Buddhism, it's not about being egotistical or arrogant. It's about just having this same level. We talk about equanimity, a same level of compassion and care and kindness that you'd want to cultivate towards other beings, also for yourself. So seeing yourself in a very equal way, like not putting yourself up too high, but also not putting yourself down too low, right? And then in this class, one of the teachings by Mingyur Rinpoche, he really stresses the importance of doing the kind of self work, the self practice, because if we want to be of benefit to others, it's really important that we also heal ourselves and care for ourselves and develop this kindness and compassion towards ourselves, and balance this with generating wisdom in terms of understanding these teachings, understanding the nature of reality, and then putting them into practice. So wisdom and compassion are often sort of described as kind of two wings of the same bird. They're both, they need to be kind of cultivated and developed together. In a similar way, yeah, we need to be like working on oneself at the same time as that we're also working on trying to create and send love and kindness out into the world for others.
Certainly, yeah, I find that beautiful, and I think that in the secular world, even if someone is not Buddhist, they'd be able to relate to having some kind of burnout from giving too much, from caring too much for others, and not caring enough for oneself. And it sounds like the balance is struck there in this approach of care for self, compassion for self, and care for others, and care for the world, compassion for the world. So that is a wonderful message. And that leads me to the third part of your course, which is then kind of springing into this notion of how do we engage with the world. I know you're going to be talking about socially engaged Buddhism, what it means to be a bodhisattva, and how Buddhist teachings and practice can somehow provide a springboard for being inspired to be compassionate, to engage in acts and activism that will help make the world a better place, or will expand the compassion one experiences for oneself out into the world. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so as compassion is naturally arising, and as this compassionate responsibility naturally arises in you as you're doing these practices and reading these texts and understanding the nature of reality and the nature of yourself, there's then, I think, again, quite a natural sort of imperative, like non-violence, ahimsa, and non-harm are really fused within that, right? Like, so as compassion develops, karuna develops, then quite naturally also when you see yourself as like interconnected with everything, you sort of quite naturally will not want to harm others because there is no other, right? And you'll not want to harm yourself because yourself is the same as everything else, right? So as self-care and self-love grows and love for others grows, so does a natural sort of sense of wanting to minimize harm. Now, we live in a world where it's very difficult to not cause any harm at all. I could literally just brush my arm and hurt numerous beings, right? So the point is about like minimizing suffering, right? And minimizing harm. And So when we look at violence in the world, it's not just direct violence, it's also structural violence. There's a lot of things that are happening in the world that might cause harm, and particularly often to minorities. So there is a lot of injustice we know in our societies based on like racial or gender or sexuality injustice, for example, and inequality. And so there are Buddhist teachers and scholars who are very much looking at this. They're looking at the injustice in the world as a form of suffering, and as a form of harm, and their own Buddhist compassion that they have generated is bringing them to involve themselves in practices and teachings to address some of these inequalities within their own communities, sanghas, we call them in Buddhism, but also out in the world. So this week, we'd be drawing on readings and also teachings by and practices by Lama Rod Owens, by Nalika Gajawira, and also Anne Glegg. And also we're listening to videos and material by Thich Nhat Hanh and Sulak Sivaraksa on socially engaged Buddhism. So they really pioneered socially engaged Buddhism coming out of their own contexts in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia. And so there's work there that is about human suffering, but also to address environmental issues and suffering of animals, and also like issues pertaining to climate change and environmental harm.
I think a lot of our listeners will really appreciate this particular section of the course who are accustomed to studying the Jain tradition, because so much of what you said overlaps so much with what many of our students encounter in their Jain studies. And one of the things that is often expressed, one of the stereotypes that's often expressed about Jainism, and I know also about Buddhism and also about yoga, is that people become too self-absorbed, too self-centered, too self-focused, which certainly can happen depending on how they're practicing, who they're practicing with. But the kind of socially engaged Buddhism that you're describing here really takes down some of those stereotypes, disarms some of those stereotypes, because we can clearly see, I heard you mention Thich Nhat Hanh, for example, that some of the most compassionate, seemingly peaceful, loving, compassionate people are also simultaneously doing so much to try to make the world a better place. And Thich Nhat Hanh was such a wonderful example of that compassionate activism, if you want to call it that, at socially engaged Buddhism. And so I'm hoping that when students study this section and learn about this, that they'll also see that there are ways of practicing these traditions, including Buddhism, that are clearly engaged with the world and do try to address that structural injustice that we all know is so, it's in our faces every day, isn't it? In the media, in the news. And what do we do with that? And so there's a place for rest, it sounds like, from that. And there's a place to kind of get back up, spring off the mat, as you've written in the syllabus, describe it, to try to do what we can to make some of that, make the world a better place. And that then brings us into the fourth part of your class, which is, I think, now we're really getting into your tradition, right? We're in Dzogchen Buddhism, non-action, and compassionate responsiveness. And so this is a tradition that you've practiced in, that you've written about, that I know you're passionate about. Can you tell us what students can expect to encounter as they learn about, from you, your own tradition, and how it relates to this compassionate responsibility?
So Dzogchen, there's a real interest in Dzogchen Buddhism at the moment, in like contemporary Buddhism. And that was kind of prophesized even, that it would be kind of later that these Dzogchen teachings would have like real kind of salience in broader society. And they're known as the Great Perfection teachings. And Longchen Rabjam, who was a 14th century Dzogchen master, also very well known Buddhist scholar and practitioner. So we're particularly inspired here by his teachings, which actually the translations that are available now, they're really timeless. These texts, one of them, The Precious Treasury of the Basic Space of Phenomena, is a text which I personally have been meditating or non-meditating on for about 7 years. It really is a perfect text. And it's been compared to the Tao Te Ching, actually, for its poetic clarity and beauty and profound wisdom. So we're just going to have a little taste of this in the fourth class, but also the way that these 14th century teachings are being taught now and interpreted by contemporary teachers and arguably, real life Buddhas or certainly Bodhisattvas, Mingyur Rinpoche and Klein. So in this class, we're going to look at some of the poetry. We're going to, I will present a little bit of Longchenpa's actual teachings, and then we'll use them as a basis to non-meditate on and to practice what is known as Treksho, which is a form of non-meditation, which involves, resting in the blissful, compassionate state. And I love this quote from Mingyur Rinpoche, actually. He says, non-meditation is the best meditation. So basically, the meditation is just to be present and to recognize your fundamental nature within yourself. So the first part of the class will hopefully be, in a sense, we call it in Dzogchen, a pointing out instruction, something that will point us to this natural state within us and within all beings. But we're also going to discover how this, because Dzogchen is sometimes also, as you were mentioning, Chris, like Dzogchen is sometimes criticized for its kind of emphasis on, non-doing and on spontaneity and as being maybe a bit too radical. And actually, and there has been some scholarship, recent scholarship, a couple of PhD theses that I will also, draw on in my presentation and cite that really stresses how, one by Adam Lobel, is how this non-action can actually naturally and spontaneously generate this, Lobel calls it compassionate responsiveness. Compassionate responsibility that Longchen Rabjam refers to towards all beings. And then there's this other phrase linking us directly back to contemporary understandings of compassion that we've been discussing, that Longchen Rabjam uses in his commentary on this text, actually, and he calls it the heart drop. And in some of the readings in the previous weeks, Lama Rod Owens talks about the importance of tapping into and feeling one and other people's brokenheartedness. Tara Brach emphasizes like heart softening. And so these things are really important to Buddhism, but especially to Dzogchen. And I think in contemporary Buddhism, a lot of people can get a little bit lost on the techniques and the superpowers and the doing of it all and what the doing is supposed to produce. And also, even though we're supposed to kind of drop away from this getting fixed on all these concepts, in Buddhism, like there's a lot of that, right? And the heart drop is just this wonderful reminder that, at the core of it, yes, we need to have a clear, awake mind, an aware mind and wise mind, but that also it is really all about the heart, and the heart is where the compassion is cultivated. And in Buddhism, actually, the heart and the mind are not two separate things. They're often, described as a heart mind, as both of these, again, those wings, the compassion wisdom wing, working together. So this dropping into the heart, I mean, I've literally experienced it in meditation when, like, being on some of these long retreats and being in the blissful natural state is a really wonderful experience, and certainly, very liberating, but at the same time, a little bit missing something almost. And I feel that when one begins to experience this kind of heart drop, and as Mingyur Rinpoche calls the luminous mind, there's something happens there where you literally feel kind of hugged by the universe, like held and hugged by the universe. And again, in terms of the things that we're emphasizing and focusing on in this course, I think that's so important to remember. So again, that natural kind of loving, compassionate quality that's there that we can tap into at any time through literally doing nothing, through just resting in it. So yeah, we're going to do some practice, and the practice is beautiful because it doesn't even stress, having to sit in a cross-legged position or anything. Like all Longchenpa says is just rest in a comfortable position. So you just to be comfortable, to be still, to be quiet. And I think the thing in our crazy, fast-paced lives, the most important thing, and we will talk about this all the way through too, is this kind of minimizing of distractions. So even though we call it non-meditation, spending some time each day, even if it's a short period of time, on doing nothing and just reconnecting with these qualities that are naturally there in us and in the universe is really important thing to do or not do.
Yeah, I love how you put it that way. And even in the course title, we have non in parentheses next to action. So what does that tell you, right? And I really appreciate what you said about the heart and the mind kind of being one thing here as we're talking about this, because there's a kind of intellectual journey that takes place. And I mean, Arihanta Institute is an intellectual organization, but there's also something about the heart and what we experience emotionally and what we experience, what we don't consider this part of our intellect per se, that has to be connected to all of this. And it seems to all come together in the system that you're describing, where one doesn't have to be sacrificed for the other. And it sounds like, as you say, two wings. We can appreciate the kind of wisdom intellectual journey, and then also how that connects with our heart, and not see them as two separate things. And I was thinking here as you were saying this, being hugged by the universe, that maybe some of our listeners who haven't practiced before might be able to relate through something like, I know when I go on vacation and I actually do kind of start letting things go, you start to feel a little bit more like what you think is yourself. And I imagine that these meditations probably lead to a very profound and deep sense of that feeling that some may get when they've had those spontaneous moments during vacations or during retreats or whatever, that they've been able to kind of start to tap into that feeling. And so this is wonderful about this course, because you're giving the intellectual piece, but you're also giving this kind of heart connected piece, and also walking through this very this fine line between action and non-action, and what that means in spiritual practice. So we're really looking forward to it, and to having a course on Buddhism on our website as we expand these offerings in compassion studies. I'm so happy and grateful that you're offering something from the Buddhist perspective for the students. So we always end the podcast with a question for those who are teaching in the Compassion Studies Initiative, and that is this, Anna: how can our listeners begin to develop more compassion in their lives?
Well, I think maybe the best answer to that is something that you just said also, Chris, is about like just spending a little bit of time each day. Like literally, it can just be 5 minutes if they want to get a head start before doing the course, of just, you use the phrase tapping into it. And in Dzogchen, we use this phrase of pointing out, which I'd mentioned before. So I think the important thing is, like, if you can find a place to sit, or as I said before, even lie down, just in it, the main thing is this comfortable position, and to be still and to be quiet and to just rest. And then what can be really helpful, I think, is to help us tap into it, is to maybe like just remember something beautiful, like remember something that generates that warm-hearted feeling. So whether that is love that you've experienced from a person or your child or your animal companion, or whether it's your favorite place, somewhere where you just love to go to refresh or to rest. For me, I'm very fortunate. I have a friend's beautiful, like a water hole on a beautiful property in a forest. It's like my, happiest, most blissful place where I love to go and sit and meditate. So yeah, if you just give yourself that opportunity to rest, just shut everything down and have a warm-hearted feeling, either generated by something beautiful around you or a memory of something beautiful, and just be with that. Like, just be with that as a way to begin to tap into this underlying blissful natural state that's kind of always there. I think even just knowing that you can have that moment whenever you need it might help you, or help us all, develop a little bit of that stillness and the self-care and that sense, you said, Chris, of like reconnecting with yourself, like your real self, not the small self-grasping self, but the big luminous compassionate self, and that you'll be held by that. You can feel kind of like held by that. I think that might be like a really nice little practice that anyone could take even from today's talk and do in your own time. I'll end with something a bit radical on Dzogchen. I love to remember that Buddha got enlightened sitting under a tree. We forget that. So that connection with nature, I think, is so important. And also in terms of pointing us, helping us remember all these positive, beautiful qualities in ourselves and in the world, creative qualities, but also compassionate qualities. Like just the fact that every day there's a sunset, there's a sunrise, there's beauty all around us all the time. I think these things are also pointing out instructions, right? Like the whole universe, the more than human universe, is not just Buddhist teachers, the whole more than human universe is pointing us to this, like reminding us about this all the time. So maybe that's just a final little takeaway, and something that we can also just keep recalling all through the day, this loving, compassionate underlying quality of the universe and of ourselves and one another.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. And I can tell the students now that you have your homework before class starts. Take the 5 minutes and see the more than human universe and the beauty in it and connecting with that. I think this is just such a wonderful message to hear, and something we can all certainly do when we're done here listening to the podcast, and make a habit of doing this every day. And when we come to your course, Buddhism, Non-Action and Compassionate Responsibility, we'll already have had a sense of tapping into what it is that you have shared with us. So I really want to thank you, Professor Anna Halafoff from Deakin University, for joining me today on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. We hope our listeners have enjoyed learning about Buddhism, non-action, and compassionate responsibility, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum, spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more, can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.